Hey guys, welcome to the third part of our discussion about the capital gains taxation. And gaya na sinabi ko in the previous videos, etong dinidiscuss ko is taken from the book of Sir Rex B. Banggawan, CPA, MBA. Yung book niya ay Income Taxation, Laws, Principles, and Applications. Alright, so let us now start our discussion starting off with the capital gains tax rate. So, dati sa NIRC or yung tinatawag natin na old law, yung capital gains tax rate natin is 5% and 10%. So, 5% with respect to the net capital gain up to 100,000 pesos. Tapos, in excess of the 100,000 pesos, that will be subject to the 10% capital gains tax rate. And this CGT rates is applicable to all taxpayers regardless of the classification. So again, it's applicable to all taxpayers regardless of classification. Now, we have the train law. So train law is already in effect. And then, because of this train law, naging simplified yung capital gains tax rate natin and to 15%. So, this 15% is applicable only for the individuals and domestic corporations. So, how about the foreign corporations? So, yung foreign corporations, yung gagamitin na capital gains tax rate ay yung 5%, 10% na capital gains tax rate. So, ayan. So, as you guys can see, for foreign corporations, yung capital gains tax rate ay yung NIRC imposed na 2/3, 5%, 10% CGT rates. So, 5% with respect to the net capital gain up to 100,000 pesos. Tapos, in excess to that, 10% yung magiging CGT rates. So, ibig sabihin, because of the train law, meron tayong dalawang capital gains tax rates that are in effect today. Number 1 is yung 5%, 10% CGT rates para sa mga foreign corporations. And then the other one is the flat tax rate of 15% para sa individuals and para sa domestic corporations. Let us now move on to the tax compliance under the old law. So, yung old law dito, ibig sabihin dito is yung NIRC. So, there are two aspects of compliance under the NIRC. The first one is the transactional capital gains tax, and then number 2 is the annual capital gains tax. So, for the transactional capital gains tax, yung capital gains or losses daw ay kailangang i-report every after sale, exchange, and other disposition using the BIR Form 1707, which is the capital gains tax return. Okay, so we have here an illustration on how to compute for the capital gains tax. Okay, so here's the situation. A taxpayer disposed his investments in domestic stocks costing 100,000 pesos directly to a buyer. It paid on the sale 2,000 pesos and 500 pesos respectively for the broker's commission and documentary stamp tax expense. So, anong nangyari? Si taxpayer daw, binenta niya yung kanyang domestic stocks directly to a buyer. Yung cost ng domestic stocks niya ay 100,000 pesos. Tapos, nagbayad siya ng 2,000 pesos para sa broker's commission and then nagbayad din siya ng 500 pesos para sa documentary stamp tax expense. So, here's the assumption. Assume that the selling price of the stocks is 180,000 pesos. So, assume natin na yung stocks ni taxpayer ay binenta niya for 180,000 pesos. So, here's our requirement or here's our task. We have to compute for the transactional capital gains tax under the NIRC or the old law. So, bago natin malaman or makompute kung magkano yung transactional capital gains tax, kailangan muna nating i-compute yung capital gains. So, paano ba i-compute yung capital gains? So, that would be selling price minus or less the total expenses. The answer to that is either a capital gain or loss. Alright. So, magkano yung selling price ng domestic stocks? That is 180,000. And then, as I said earlier, we're going to less the expenses. So, ano-ano yung expenses? Of course, the cost of the stocks, which is 100,000 pesos. And then, we also have the broker's commission of 2,000. And then, documentary stamp tax of 500 pesos. So, we'll total the expenses. So, 100,000 plus 2,000 plus 500, that is equal to 102,500 pesos. And then, selling price of 180,000 pesos less the total cost and expenses of 102,500 pesos. So, mas malaki yung selling price. So, merong capital gain amounting to 77,500 pesos. So, now that we already knew how much is the capital gain, pwede na tayong mag-proceed doon sa transactional capital gains tax. Take note ha yung requirement under NIRC. So, magkano yung transactional capital gains tax under the NIRC? So, tingnan natin kung ano ba yung capital gains tax rates under the NIRC. Ito. So, under the NIRC, meron tayong 5%, 10%, 5% para sa net gain up to 100,000. Or for the first 100,000 pesos, yung equivalent CGT rate niya ay 5%. Tapos, in excess of the 100,000, yung yung CGT rate ay 10%. Okay, balikan natin yung computation natin. So, yung capital gain based on our computation is 77,500 pesos. So, ano ba yung magiging capital gains tax rate niya? That would be this one. Since 77,500 pesos is below 100,000 pesos, so yung applicable na capital gains tax rate niya is the 5%. So therefore, 77,500 pesos times 5%. So the capital gains tax due is 3,875 pesos. Let's now have another assumption. So let us assume that the selling price of the stocks is 240,000 pesos. So magkano ba yung magiging transactional capital gains tax pag yung selling price ng stocks is 240,000 pesos? So, we are still computing for the transactional capital gains tax under the NIRC or the old law. Alright, so, again, bago natin malaman or bago natin makompute kung magkano yung transactional CGT, kailangan muna nating alamin kung magkano yung capital gain. So, in order to get the capital gain, we need to subtract the total cost and expenses from the selling price. So, we have the selling price, 240,000, less the total cost and expenses. So, ano-ano yung mga cost and expenses involved. So, we have, of course, the cost of the shares, which is 100,000. And then we have the broker's commission of 2,000. And lastly, we have the documentary stamp tax of 500. So, let's total the three. The total cost and expenses would be 102,500 pesos. Okay. So, selling price of 240,000 minus the total cost and expenses of 102,500 pesos. So, there is a capital gain of 137,500 pesos. So, since we already have the amount for the capital gain, so we're now ready to compute for the transactional capital gains tax under NIRC. So, I'm going to show you again the capital gains tax rates under the NIRC. Okay, you have to memorize this one, ha? So, we have 5% for the first 100,000 pesos net capital gain. Tapos, in excess to the 100,000, that would be subject to the 10% capital gains tax rate. So, based on our computation, yung capital gain is 137,500 pesos. So, magkano ba yung magiging transactional capital gains tax niya? So for the first 100,000 pesos, that will be subject to the 5% CGT rate. So we have 100,000 times 5%, that is equal to 5,000 pesos. And then, as I said earlier, in excess of the 100,000 pesos, that will be subject to the 10% CGT rate. So we have the capital gain of 137,500 pesos minus the first 100,000. So merong balance na 37,500 pesos. And that will be multiplied by the 10% CGT rate. So that is equal to 3,750 pesos. And then we're going to add this one, 5,000 plus 3,750. So the total capital gains tax due is 8,750 pesos. So now let's have another illustration. Actually, we're still using the same problem. Yung naiiba lang is this time, yung computation natin is under the train law. So kanina, it was under the NIRC law. Ngayon naman, yung i-compute natin dito is the transactional capital gains tax under the train law. And then we have here the assumption na yung selling price of the stocks is 180,000 pesos. Okay. So, as what I've told you earlier, bago natin malaman kung magkano yung transactional capital gains tax, dapat muna nating alamin kung magkano yung capital gain. So, we have the selling price of 180,000 less the total cost and expenses. So, what are the what are the cost and expenses involved? So, we have the cost of the stocks, which is 100,000 plus the broker's commission of 2,000 and then plus the 500 pesos documentary stamp tax. So the total cost and expenses is 102,500 pesos. So 180,000 less 102,500. So there is a capital gain of 77,500 pesos. And as I mentioned earlier, yung task natin dito is to compute for the transactional capital gains tax under the train law. So magkano yung capital gains tax rate under the train law. Okay, so we have here under the train law, we have the simplified flat tax rate of 15% for individuals and domestic corporations. So si taxpayer dito is an individual. So under train law, we're going to use the 15%. So we have the capital gain of 77,500 pesos multiplied by the flat tax rate of 15%. So the capital gains tax due is 11,625 pesos. Now, let us assume that the selling price of the stocks is 240,000 pesos. So, how much would be the capital gains tax due under the train law? Okay, so let's compute first kung magkano yung capital gain. So, we have the selling price of 240,000 less the total cost and expenses, which comprise of the cost of the stocks, which is 100,000, plus the broker's commission of 2,000 and then plus the 500 pesos documentary stamp tax expense. So the total cost and expenses is 102,500 pesos. And then the difference between the selling price and the total cost and expenses is 137,500 pesos. So that is 240,000 less or minus 102,500 pesos. And then take note that yung task natin dito is to compute for the transactional capital gains tax under the train law. So, magkano yung CGT rate under train law? We have 15%. So, therefore, to get the capital gains tax due, we only need to multiply the capital gain of 137,500 pesos multiplied by the flat tax rate or the CGT rate under train law, which is 15%. So the total capital gains tax due is 20,625 pesos. Moving on to the deadline of the transactional CGT return or BIR Form 1707. So, kailan ba yung deadline for filing? So, sabi dito, yung BIR Form 1707 or CGT return dapat ma-file yan within 30 days after each sale, exchange, and other disposition of stocks. And then, if the tax is qualified for payment under installment method, so dapat yung CGT return or BIR Form 1707 ay ma-file na within 30 days after each installment. Okay, so balikan natin yung tax compliance under the old law. So the number 1 transactional CGT is already discussed, no? Itong transactional capital gains tax, na-discuss na natin to kanina. So we'll now move on to the annual capital gains tax for foreign corporations and then for other taxpayers. Alright, so we'll start with the annualized capital gains tax for foreign corporations. So, ang sabi dito, the capital gains tax is recomputed on the annual net gains. Then, previous tax payments are treated as tax credit thereto. And then, after such credit, a residual tax due is paid while excess transactional payment is claimed as tax refund or tax credit. So, ano bang ibig sabihin dito? So, under annualized capital gains tax for foreign corporations, kailangan natin mag-compute uli ng capital gains tax for the year. Tapos, yung previous capital gains tax payments natin, we're going to sum it up and then we're going to deduct it from the annual net capital gain. Tapos, yung result niyan is either capital gains tax payable or refundable. Kailan ba payable? Pag mas malaki yung kinompute natin na annual capital gains tax due compared to the total transactional capital gains tax previously paid during the year. And then refundable naman kapag mas malaki yung total transactional capital gains taxes paid during the year kaysa sa yung kinompute natin na annual capital gains tax due. Naintindihan? I'm sure medyo blurry pa, no? So, we'll have this illustration para malinaw. Assume that a foreign corporation had the following disposition of several equity securities directly to a buyer for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2020. I'm sorry for the misspelled word ha. Yung directly, isang R lang yun. Okay, so this is now the information regarding the disposition of the equity securities of the foreign corporation. So, on January 12, 2020, yung preferred stocks niya ay nabenta for 210,000 pesos. Tapos, yung cost and expenses is only 100,000 pesos. So, mas malaki yung selling price kaysa cost and expenses or therefore merong capital gain na 110,000 pesos. So, how to get the 110,000 pesos? So, that is 210,000 pesos selling price less the total cost and expenses of 100,000 pesos. That will give you the 110,000 pesos capital gain. And then the corresponding capital gains tax due for that is 6,000 pesos. Now question, bakit ba nagbayad ng capital gains tax? Recall that there are two aspects of compliance under the previous law or the NIRC. One is the transactional capital gains tax and then the second one is the annual capital gains tax. So, sa transactional capital gains tax, kailangan nating magbayad and then mag-file ng CGT return within 30 days after every sale or disposition of stocks. So, again, every after sale and disposition of stocks. So that means, pag nagbenta ka ng stocks, you need to file and pay the capital gains tax. You need to pay the capital gains tax and you need to file the CGT return. So that explains kung bakit may binayaran na capital gains tax on the sale of stocks made on January 12. Now, how to get the 6,000 pesos capital gains tax? So we need to use this one. So, for the first 100,000 pesos na net capital gain, that will be subject to the 5% CGT rate. So, that is 100,000 times 5%, that is equal to 5,000 pesos. And then, okay, 110,000 less the first 100,000, so there is an excess of 10,000 pesos. And that will be subject to 10%. So 10,000 times 10%, that is equal to 1,000. So 5,000 plus 1,000, that made up the 6,000 capital gains tax. Now, the next transaction happened on March 18, 2020. So we have here the common stocks are sold for 80,000 pesos, and then the cost and expenses is 90,000 pesos. So mas malaki yung cost and expenses kaysa selling price. So therefore meron tayong capital loss of 10,000 pesos. So that is 80,000 minus 90,000. So it's a loss of 10,000 pesos. Bakit loss? Kasi mas malaki yung cost and expenses kaysa selling price. Now, since this is a capital loss, so therefore, walang babayaran na capital gains tax. Uulitin ko ha, hindi na tayo magbabayad ng capital gains tax at hindi tayo magpa-file ng capital gains tax return pag yung result ng sale is a capital loss. So, kailan ba may capital loss? Kapag mas malaki yung total cost and expenses kaysa selling price. Okay, let's move on to the next transaction, which took place on May 14, 2020. So, we have stock rights that are sold for 160,000 pesos. Tapos, yung cost and expenses is 70,000 pesos. So, mas malaki yung selling price kaysa cost and expenses. So, therefore, merong capital gain. So, magkano yung capital gain? So, that is 160,000 pesos minus 70,000 pesos. So, that is equal to 90,000 pesos capital gain. So, how much is the corresponding capital gains tax to that? Here's the CGT rate. So, we have here again the 5% with respect to the net capital gain up to 100,000 pesos. Tapos, in excess to the 100,000 pesos, that will be subject to 10% CGT rate. And since the capital gain here is 90,000 pesos, so that is below 100,000. So the applicable CGT rate would be 5%. So 90,000 times 5%, that is equal to the capital gains tax due of 4,500 pesos. Now let's move on to the last transaction, which took place on June 17, 2020. So we have here stock options that are sold for 80,000 pesos. The cost and expenses for that is 100,000. So, mas malaki yung cost and expenses compared to the selling price. So, therefore, merong capital loss amounting to 20,000 pesos. How did we arrive at the 20,000 pesos capital loss? So, that is by deducting the cost and expenses of 100,000 pesos from the selling price of 80,000. So, that's 80,000 pesos minus 100,000 pesos. So, that is equal to the capital loss of 20,000 pesos. And then, we are talking about the annualized capital gains tax for foreign corporations. And then, sabi dito, we need to recompute the capital gains tax on the annual net gains. And then, yung previous tax payments natin is going to be deducted as tax credit. So, going back to our illustration, so this is all about a foreign corporation. And then, we have to get how much is the annual capital gains tax due. Okay. To do that, we need to get first how much is the annual net capital gain. So, the annual net capital gain here is 170,000 pesos. So, how to get that? We have 110,000 pesos capital gain minus the capital loss on March 18, which is 10,000, and then plus the capital gain of 90,000 pesos on May 14, and then minus the capital loss on June 17, which is 20,000. So, the answer to that is 170,000 pesos. So, ito yung annual net capital gain. Ayan, 170,000 pesos. So, now that we already have our net capital gain, so we are now set to compute how much is the annual capital gains tax due. Kasi, as I mentioned earlier, is an annualized capital gains tax for foreign corporations. We need to recompute how much is the annual capital gains tax due. And since we already have the annual net capital gain, which is the 170,000, so pwede na nating i-determine kung magkano yung annual capital gains tax due. So we're going to use this one. So for the first 100,000 pesos, the corresponding capital gains tax rate is 5%. So that is 100,000 times 5%. So the capital gains tax due for that is 5,000. And then the remaining balance, so that is 170,000 tapos minus the first 100,000, so merong excess na 70,000. And the 70,000 will be multiplied with the CGT rate of 10% kasi this is the excess of 100,000. So 70,000 times 10%, that is equal to 7,000. And then we're going to add 5,000 plus 7,000, that is equal to 12,000 pesos. And then we're going to deduct the previous capital gains tax payment made during the year. So we have 10,500. So that is the total of 6,000 capital gains tax on January 12, and then the 4,500 capital gains tax on May 14. So again, the total is 10,500. So we're going to deduct that one, 10,500. So 12,000 minus 10,500. So merong capital gains taxes payable na 1,500 pesos. So, it's a capital gains tax payable kasi mas malaki yung annual capital gains tax due compared to the total transactional capital gains taxes previously paid. Pero kunwari, pag mas malaki yung total transactional capital gains taxes previously paid kaysa annual capital gains tax due, yung difference is not a payable but a refundable. Deadline of annual capital gains tax return, which is the BIR Form 1707-A. So, the deadline of the annual capital gains tax return is on or before the 15th day of the 4th month following the close of the taxable year of the taxpayer. Alright, moving on to the annualized capital gains tax for other taxpayer. So the change to 15% flat tax rate under the train law would mean 15% CGT when the transaction resulted to a gain, but would instantly mean a 15% CGT refundable when the transaction resulted to a loss. So what does it mean? So, para maintindihan natin, let's go to the illustration. So, assume that an individual taxpayer had the following transactions during the year. On January 12, we have preferred stocks that are sold for 210,000 pesos, and then the cost and expenses is 100,000. So, 210 minus 100, so there is a capital gain of 110,000 pesos, and the corresponding transactional capital gains tax for that is 16,500. So how to get this one? That is by simply multiplying the 110,000 capital gain by the flat tax rate of 15%. So 110,000 times 15%, that would give you 16,500 pesos. Next is on March 18. Common stocks are sold for 80,000 pesos, and then the cost and expenses is 90,000. So 80 minus 90, so therefore there is a capital loss of 10,000 pesos. Next is on May 14. So stock rights are sold for 160,000 pesos, and then the corresponding cost and expenses is only 70,000 pesos. So 160 minus 70, so there is a capital gain of 90,000 pesos. And then the equivalent transactional capital gains tax for that is 13,500 pesos. How to get that? So multiply the capital gain of 90,000 times the flat tax rate of 15%. And then lastly, we have the sale of stock options on June 17 for 80,000 when its cost and expenses is 100,000. So therefore, there is a capital loss of 20,000. So capital loss, so therefore walang binabayaran na or walang babayaran na capital gains tax. So the total capital gain here is 170,000 pesos. So that is 110,000 capital gain less the capital loss of 10,000 plus the capital gain of 90,000 and then less the capital loss of 20,000. And then the total capital gains tax paid is 30,000 pesos. So that is 16,500 plus the 13,500. Now, how much is the final capital gains tax payable or refundable under the train law? So here's a computation. So we'll start with the annual net capital gain of 170,000. And then we're going to multiply it by the flat tax rate of 15% since we are computing under the train law. So 170,000 times 15%, that is equal to 25,500 pesos. So this is now the annual capital gains tax. And then take note that merong previously paid na transactional capital gains tax amounting to 30,000 pesos. That's the total. So we're going to less this one by the 30,000 pesos transactional CGT that is previously paid. So 25,500 capital gains tax less the previously paid CGT of 30,000. So merong capital gains tax refundable amounting to 4,500 pesos. Bakit refundable? Kasi mas malaki yung previously paid na transactional CGT kaysa annual capital gains tax. Okay, so eto ngayon yung problema. If we're going to compute the capital gains tax due, just like this one, etong procedure na to is pattern with the NIRC. So, pag ganito yung gagamitin natin na procedure, there will always be a capital gains tax refundable because of the existence of the transactional loss. Just like here in this illustration. Uulitin ko ha. So, in this illustration, yung ginamit natin na CGT rate is yung CGT rate ng train law, which is the flat tax rate of 15%. Pero yung procedure ng ating computation is pattern sa NIRC. As you noticed here in the table, si taxpayer nagbabayad siya ng capital gains tax based on how much is the capital gain per transaction. This is why on January 12, yung capital gain amounting to 110,000 pesos ay minultiply right away with a flat tax rate of 15%. And that is equal to 16,500. And also with the capital gain on the sale made on June 17. May 14. So the capital gain was 90,000 and then minultiply siya right away with 15%. So the answer to that is 13,500. So ganito yung procedure sa NIRC. This procedure of computation is definitely okay pag walang transaction loss or capital loss. Yung problem kasi kapag merong transaction loss or capital loss, just like here in this illustration, merong capital loss on March 18 and June 17. Because of this transaction losses or capital losses, magkakaroon talaga ng capital gains tax refundable at the end. That's why here, sa solution natin, merong capital gains tax refundable which is 4,500 pesos. Now, ano bang gagawin natin to refrain from this kind of problem? So, ang sabi dito, the best procedure to do is to do the offsetting. So, i-offset daw muna natin lahat ng losses first with the subsequent gains during the year. So, magkakaroon lang ng tax payments or magbabayad lang tayo ng capital gains tax pag mas malaki na yung subsequent gains compared to the losses. For example, let us assume the following series of capital gains and losses during the year. For transaction number 1, meron tayong net capital gain of 200,000 pesos. And then the corresponding transactional capital gains tax due for that is 30,000 pesos. So that is 200,000 pesos net capital gain multiplied by the flat tax rate of 15%. So ito yung CGT rate under the train law. So the answer to that is 30,000 pesos. So ito yung babayaran na transactional capital gains tax. For transaction number 2, meron tayong net capital loss of 40,000 pesos. So, since this is a capital loss, so wala tayong babayaran na capital gains tax. For transaction number 3, meron tayong net capital gain of 30,000 pesos. So, question, magbabayad na ba tayo ng capital gains tax due? Magbabayad na ba tayo ng capital gains tax for this? So, ano yung sabi ko kanina? So, we have to do the offsetting. So, i-offset muna natin yung transaction losses against the subsequent capital gains. And then, magbabayad lang tayo ng capital gains tax pag mas malaki na yung capital gain compared to the transaction losses. So, balikan natin. Magkano yung net capital loss on transaction number 2? 40,000. Yung capital gain sa transaction number 3 is 30,000. So, 40,000 transaction loss minus the 30,000 pesos transaction gain or net capital gain. So, the difference is still a net capital loss of 10,000 pesos. So, magbabayad ba tayo ng capital gains tax for the transaction number 3? Hindi pa. Kasi merong net capital loss of 10,000. For transaction number 4, meron tayong net capital gain of 60,000 pesos. But don't forget, meron tayong net capital loss as of transaction number 3 amounting to 10,000 pesos. So we need to offset that one. So 60,000 pesos net capital gain minus the 10,000 pesos net capital loss. So the answer to that is a net capital gain of 50,000 pesos. And then we're going to multiply this one with a flat tax rate of 15%. So the capital gains tax due for transaction number 4 is 7,500 pesos. So 30,000 capital gains tax in transaction number 1 plus the capital gains tax on transaction number 4, which is 7,500 pesos. So the total capital gains tax due for the year is 37,500 pesos. So as you can see, wala na tayong refundable nor payable dito. Kasi if you're going to check if the 37,500 pesos total capital gains tax due, kung eto lang ba talaga yung babayaran na capital gains tax during the year, you can do that by multiplying the total net capital gain during the year, which is 250,000. So how to get the 250,000? So that is 200,000 minus 40,000 plus 30,000 plus 60,000. So that will give you the net capital gain of 250,000. And then you're going to multiply it with a CGT rate of 15%. That will also give you the 37,500 pesos total annual capital gains tax due. And that means si taxpayer dito hindi na kailangan pa mag-file ng BIR Form 1707A. Kasi that BIR Form 1707A would be required kung merong refundable or net refund during the year. Another example, assume the following series of capital gains and losses during the year. For the first transaction, we have a net capital gain of 200,000 pesos. And then we're going to multiply it with a flat tax rate of 15%. So the capital gains tax is 30,000 pesos. And then for transaction number 2, there is a net capital loss of 240,000. So it's a capital loss, so therefore hindi tayo magbabayad ng capital gains tax. For transaction number 3, there is a net capital gain of 60,000 pesos. Magbabayad na ba tayo ng capital gains tax for this? Hindi pa. No. We're going to offset this net capital gain against the previous capital loss. So the previous capital loss is 240,000 and then minus the capital gain of 60. So the difference is a net capital loss of 180,000. So, wala pa ring babayaran na capital gains tax. Then, let's total how much is the total capital gains tax due for the year. So, we have 30,000 kasi wala nang iba. Now, if we're going to check if 30,000 pesos capital gains tax due is really the correct amount of capital gains tax, what we're going to do is just to simply multiply the yearly total or the annual net capital gain by the 15%. So the annual net capital gain here is 20,000. So how to get the 20,000? That is 200,000 minus 240,000 plus 60,000. So that will give you 20,000. And then you're going to multiply it by 15%. So the annual net capital gains tax due is 3,000. So this is the correct annual net capital gains tax due, 3,000 pesos. And then take note that we have previous transactional capital gains tax paid for the first transaction, which is 30,000. So we're going to less this one. So there is a refundable of 27,000. So that is 3,000 annual net capital gains tax minus the previously paid CGT of 30,000. So there is a CGT refundable of 27,000 pesos. And this means that si taxpayer kailangan niya mag-file ng BIR form 1707 for the tax refundable. Okay, let's now proceed. So we are now here in the installment payment of the capital gains tax. So pwedeng magkaroon ng installment payment ng CGT kapag yung domestic stocks are sold in installment, provided na etong dalawang conditions are met. Number one, dapat yung selling price exceeds 1,000 pesos. Tapos yung initial payment does not exceed 25% of the selling price. Do not forget these two conditions, ha? Okay, so let's jump into the illustration para maintindihan natin itong concept na to. On November 1, 2019, Mr. Batanes made a sale of domestic stocks costing 700,000 pesos directly to a buyer for 1 million pesos. The buyer agreed to pay in 100,000 pesos monthly installments starting November 30. So, ang una nating gagawin dito is to get the net capital gain, and then after that, we're going to get the capital gains tax due. So to get the net capital gain, we need the selling price. So the selling price of the stocks here is 1 million. And then we're going to less the cost of the stocks, which is 700,000 pesos. And then there is no other expenses involved. So ito lang, yung cost ng shares, which is 700,000. So 1 million minus 700,000. So the net capital gain here is 300,000 pesos. And then to get the capital gains tax due, we're going to multiply it with the CGT rate, which is the flat tax rate of 15%. So 300,000 times 15%. So the net capital gains tax due is 45,000 pesos. For case number 1, we have to assume that there is no mortgage on the shares sold. In this illustration, si Mr. Batanes, binenta niya yung domestic stocks niya in installment. So, ang tanong ngayon, pwede din bang bayaran ni Mr. Batanes yung capital gains tax niya na 45,000 pesos through installment? So, how to know kung qualified ba si Mr. Batanes to do that? We have to check whether the two conditions are met. So, ano yung conditions? First one, dapat yung selling price exceeds 1,000 pesos. Tapos yung second one, dapat yung initial payment does not exceed 25% of the selling price. Alright, let's find out if these conditions are met. For the first condition, dapat yung selling price exceeds 1,000 pesos. So, magkano ba yung selling price ng domestic stocks dito? 1 million pesos. So obviously, this is more than 1,000 pesos. So that means this criteria is met. So let's put a check mark on that. The second condition, sabi dito, dapat yung initial payment does not exceed 25% of the selling price. So, ano naman yung initial payment? Yung initial payment is consist of the down payment plus the installment payments made in the year of sale. So, tingnan natin sa illustration. Meron bang down payment? Wala. So, let's move to the installment payment. Kailan yung first installment? Sabi dito, that would start on November 30 of the same year. How much is the installment payment each month? 100,000. So for November, we have 100,000 pesos installment payment. Ayan. And then, the second installment is on December 31. That is still in the year of the sale. 2019. So there's another 100,000. So the total is 200,000 pesos. So that's the total initial payment. Now we have to get the ratio of the initial payment to its selling price. So the total initial payment again is 200,000 pesos. So we're going to divide it with the selling price, which is 1 million pesos. So the ratio of initial payment is 20%. So ano ba yung sabi sa condition? Dapat yung initial payment does not exceed 25% of the selling price. So in our computation, the ratio here is 20%. So it does not exceed 25% of the selling price. So that means the second condition is also met. So we're going to check this. So what does it mean? The two conditions are met. So therefore, the taxpayer is qualified to pay the capital gains tax due in installment. Now, the question is how much of the 45,000 pesos capital gains tax is going to be paid in every installment? So, how to compute? So, we have this formula in determining the capital gains tax payable in every installment. So, we have collection divided by the contract price and then multiplied by the capital gains tax. So, what is this contract price? Ang contract price is the total sum of money that is collectible from the contract. So, normally, itong contract price is the selling price kapag walang indebtedness involved. Okay, so substitute natin yung value. So, how much is the collection? So, yung question dito kasi is how much is the capital gains tax to be paid in every installment? So, the collection here refers to the monthly installment, which is 100,000 pesos. And then, we're going to divide it with the contract price. Magkano yung contract price dito? That would be 1 million pesos, no? That would be the selling price. So, bakit selling price lang? Kasi walang indebtedness involved sa domestic stocks na benenta. So that is 100,000 divided by 1 million. And then we're going to multiply it with the capital gains tax. Yung kinompute natin kanina na 45,000 pesos. So the answer to that is 4,500 pesos. So etong 4,500 pesos, ito yung capital gains tax na babayaran every installment. Take note class ha, if we're going to compute for the initial payment ratio or the ratio of initial payment, yung ginagamit natin is the selling price. And then if we're going to compute how much is the capital gains tax to be paid in every installment, yung gagamitin din natin is the contract price. Okay, let's now proceed to the second illustration. So this is case number 2 and this time meron ng indebtedness involved. So sabi sa case 2, with mortgage on stocks but not in excess of the cost. So we're still using the same illustration except that we're going to assume this time that the stocks were previously mortgaged for 600,000 pesos which the buyer assumed. And then the 400,000 pesos balance is payable in monthly installments of 100,000 pesos starting November 30, 2019. Okay, so first things first, we have to compute for the net capital gains tax due. Okay, so we'll start with the selling price. The selling price of the stocks is 1 million and then we're going to less the cost, which is 700,000 pesos. So 1 million minus 700,000 pesos. So that gave us the net capital gain of 300,000 pesos and then we're going to multiply it with the CGT rate under train law, which is 15%. So 300,000 times 15%, that will give us the net capital gains tax due of 45,000 pesos. So since the domestic stocks here are sold through installment, ang tanong natin is qualified ba si Mr. Batanes na bayaran yung capital gains tax due na 45,000 pesos through installment as well. So, remember, meron tayong dalawang conditions na dapat ma-comply before eligible si Mr. Batanes na magbayad ng capital gains tax due in installment. So, ano-ano yung mga yon? Number 1 condition says that the selling price must exceed 1,000 pesos. So, magkano yung selling price sa domestic stocks dito? 1 million pesos. So, obviously, 1 million pesos exceeds 1,000 pesos. So that criteria is met. The second condition is or the second condition or the second criteria says that the initial payment must not exceed 25% of the selling price. So let's determine how much is the initial payment ratio. So the initial payment again consists of the down payment plus the installment payments made during the year of the sale. So wala tayong down payment dito. What we have is the installment payments that start on November. So that is 100,000 pesos in November, and then another installment will be on December of the same year. Another 100,000 pesos. So the total initial payment is 200,000 pesos. So to get the ratio of the initial payment, we're going to divide the total initial payment by the selling price, which is 1 million pesos. So 2 million divided by 1 million pesos. So the ratio of initial payment is 20%. So ano nga ulit yung condition? Dapat yung initial payment ratio does not exceed 25% of the selling price. And then based on our computation, it's 20%. So clearly, 20% does not exceed 25% of the selling price. So the second criteria is also met. Now, the question is how much of the 45,000 pesos net capital gains tax due is going to be paid in every installment. So, meron tayong formula for that. So, we have collection divided by the contract price multiplied by the CGT or the capital gains tax. So, ano nga uli yung contract price? It's the total sum of money that is collectible from the contract. So, normally, ang contract price is equal to the selling price. That if walang indebtedness or walang mortgage involved. Pero in this case, merong mortgage. So, ano ang gagawin natin sa mortgage? So, we're going to deduct the mortgage from the selling price. So, we have the selling price na 1 million pesos and then less the mortgage assumed which is 600,000 pesos. So, 1 million minus 600,000 pesos. So, that is equal to 400,000 pesos. So, ito na ngayon yung contract price natin. So, going back to our formula, so we have collection divided by contract price multiplied by the CGT. So, yung collection na tinutukoy dito would mean the installment payment every month. Kasi monthly yung installment dito sa illustration. So, the monthly installment is 100,000 pesos and then we're going to divide it with the contract price of 400,000 and then multiplied by the capital gains tax due of 45,000 pesos. So, the CGT payable every installment would be 11,250 pesos. Moving on to the next illustration. So, this is case number 3 with excess mortgage over cost. We're still using the same illustration except that this time we're going to assume that the stock was subject to 750,000 pesos mortgage which the buyer assumed. The 250,000 balance is payable in monthly installments of 50,000 pesos starting on November 30, 2019. Okay, take note that the amount of mortgage here is greater than the cost of the domestic stocks being sold. So the amount of the mortgage is 750,000 while the cost of the domestic stocks is 700,000 pesos. So what are we going to do if we're going to encounter this kind of situation? So, ang una nating gagawin dito, just like the other previous cases, is to get first the capital gains tax due. So, eto uli. So, we have selling price of 1 million minus the cost of the shares, which is 700,000. So, the difference is the net capital gain of 300,000 and then multiplied by 15%. So, the net capital gains tax due is 45,000 pesos. So, let's now determine if Mr. Batanes, in this case, is still qualified to pay the 45,000 pesos capital gains tax due in installment. So, the first condition is already met. Yung condition na dapat yung selling price ng stocks is more than 1,000 pesos. Kasi here in this case, the selling price is 1 million pesos. So, that criteria is already met. The second criteria na dapat i-met is that dapat yung initial payment does not exceed 25% of the selling price. So let's now compute how much is the initial payment in this case. Just to remind you, yung initial payment includes the down payment and the installment payments made during the year of the sale. So, ano-ano ba yung included dito sa initial payment? So, we have the first installment on the year of sale, which is on November 30, 2019. That is equal to 50,000 pesos. And then the second installment would be on December 31, 2019, no? Still in the same year of the sale. So we have another 50,000. And then take note ha, dito kasi yung mortgage is more than the amount of the cost of the stocks. So the mortgage is 750,000 and then yung cost ng stocks is only 700,000. So there is a difference of 50,000 pesos. So this will be part of the initial payment. Ayan. So, we call that indirect down payment. So, the total initial payment is 150,000 pesos. And then, to get the ratio, we're going to divide the total initial payment of 150,000 by the amount of the by the selling price, which is 1 million. So, 150,000 divided by 1 million. So, the ratio of initial payment is 20%. No, this is not 20%. I'm sorry. This is 15%. So, kindly correct ha. This is not 20%. That is 15%. So, 15% is still less than the 25%. So, therefore, the second condition is met. So, that means Mr. Batanes in this case is qualified to pay the capital gains tax due in installment. Yung tanong ngayon is magkano yung babayaran niya na capital gains tax due in every installment. So ito again yung formula. We have collection divided by the contract price and then multiplied by the CGT. Ano ba yung contract price? So, ang contract price, it is the total sum of money that is collectible from the contract. So, normally, yung contract price is just the selling price kapag walang indebtedness or walang mortgage involved sa domestic stocks na binenta. Pero kung merong mortgage na inassume si buyer, we have to deduct the mortgage assumed by the buyer from the selling price. So, ang mangyayari, that would be selling price minus the mortgage assumed by the buyer. So, the difference would now be the contract price. So, here in case number 3, this is a bit different kasi dito, yung mortgage na inassume ni buyer is more than the amount of the is more than the cost of the domestic stocks sold. Kasi dito, yung amount ng mortgage is 750,000. Tapos yung cost ng domestic stocks is only 700,000 pesos. So, merong difference na 50,000 pesos. So, what will be the treatment of the 50,000 pesos na excess sa mortgage? This will be the computation of the initial payment. So, we'll start with the selling price na 1 million pesos and then we're going to deduct the mortgage assumed which is 750,000 pesos. So, the difference is 250,000 pesos. So, ito yung cash collectible from the contract. And then here comes the difference between the 750,000 pesos mortgage assumed by the buyer and the cost of the domestic stocks na 700,000 pesos. Ito yung magiging treatment niya. So, we're going to add the 50,000 pesos na difference dito sa cash collectible. So, we call this one indirect down payment, diba? So, 250,000 plus the 50,000 difference of 750,000 mortgage and the 700,000 pesos cost of the domestic stock sold. So, the total contract price or the contract price is 300,000 pesos. Now that we already have the contract price, so pwede na tayong mag-compute kung magkano yung capital gains tax na babayaran in every installment. So, ito yon. By the way, during the sale, si Mr. Batanes, meron na siyang babayaran dapat na capital gains tax. That is with respect to the indirect down payment na 50,000 pesos. So, saan galing yung indirect payment na 50,000 pesos? So, that is the difference between the 750,000 pesos mortgage assumed by the buyer and the cost of the domestic tax, which is 700,000 pesos. So we have the indirect payment of 50,000, and then we're going to divide it with a contract price of 300,000. So the capital gains tax to be paid during the sale is 7,500 pesos. And then for every installment, so yung per installment is 50,000 pesos. So we have 50,000 pesos monthly installment divided by the contract price of 300,000. So the capital gains tax that will be paid in every installment is still 7,500 pesos.